Miracle wedding. From the time we'd met a year before, I had juggled 2 to 3 jobs to be able to have my own apartment and furnish it before our planned wedding. Billy had invited me to stay and work with her ministry after the door to Brazil had closed and told me that from the time she met me in New York, she knew that someday I would work with her. She mentored me in ministry, and I learned so much just working with her, praying with her, and watching how she cared for people. Through my connection with Billy, who had been Kenneth Copeland's first paid prayer coordinator, I also started working part-time for his ministry, first simply adding names into the computer data system and later in the prayer department. Steve and I both felt very strongly that we wanted to be married in Texas, even though we had just a handful of friends there. They were the friends we had started a new life with. With my family in New York and his in Canada, we understood that it would be impossible for them to all travel to Texas, but each of our parents were coming, and we had decided that for a honeymoon, we would take a cross-country trip and visit both of our hometowns and meet our families. Both families decided to have a reception for us in our respective hometowns for friends and family there. So we decided we would take a month-long honeymoon and leisurely enjoy the time. I juggled both my jobs as well as picking up extra income I could to pay for the expenses of the wedding. The day came when I put in my request at work for a month off. When the paperwork was returned, it was denied. I hadn't been working there even a year, and they had never granted a request for a month-long vacation. They agreed that if it were possible and another job was open on my return, I could be rehired, but I would have to quit to take a month off. So I did. I was so convinced that God would take care of us that I just put in my resignation. Well, money was tight, and Steve was still on a student visa and not allowed to work in the country, and he continued to volunteer his time at Vicky's ministry. I was trying to handle it all and trust God for a miracle. The night before our wedding, I was pretty stressed. Everything was paid for, including a gift for a honeymoon night in Dallas, but we had to ask my parents for $5 to put gas in the car just to make it to the wedding, and we'd told everyone that we were taking a month-long honeymoon. Well, miraculously, on our wedding day, enough cash came in wedding gifts to send us on our way. With the honeymoon night paid for, we headed on the road the following day for the Northeast. We'd stop once a day for a meal and choose a reasonably priced hotel that hopefully included a continental breakfast to save on our budget. We drove cross-country directly into Canada, and believe me, I think we drove in on fumes. We'd used every cent we had. Little did we know that Steve's family had planned a money tree reception there for us, and as we celebrated with family and friends, we were again blessed and furnished with what we needed to travel on to New York in style. My parents, both being only children, had inherited all the furniture from both their families, so they were very gracious to send us back to Texas with some beautiful pieces that helped furnish our apartment, as well as fill the U-Haul trailer with wedding gifts from friends. On top of that, the monetary gifts that we received at the New York reception paid our next month's rent and all of our expenses to return to Texas. When we pulled in the driveway to unload all of our blessings in our apartment in Fort Worth, we just looked at each other and laughed, wondering who would have a reception for us now. God had given us the desire of our heart for a month-long honeymoon. Steve continued to help Vicki Jameson by recording her radio spots, but felt called to help a pastor and approached a couple of pastors we knew in Fort Worth, but nothing had opened up for him. Some of our friends in Fort Worth hired him to do gardening or work around their homes while we awaited his resident alien status to come through that would enable him to work. In the meantime, I returned to KCM and was rehired, this time in the prayer department, which was a wonderful place to get an education of how to pray according to God's Word for a plethora of needs that came to the ministry daily. Steve was proud of the way I kept things organized, including my envelope filing system for monthly bills. Suddenly one month I went to pull out the rent envelope and it was missing. Somehow I had very organizationally thrown the envelope away. We didn't panic because we were just sure that someone would show up at the door with the money we needed. After all, God had provided for us supernaturally before. Well, someone did show up at the door, but it was with an eviction notice days later. During that time, I happened to work with a gal that would rave about her sister and her husband who pastored a church in Fort Worth. She kept saying over and over, "You and Steve should meet my sister and brother-in-law." Finally, she made the contact, and we met up one night in Denny's on the east side of Fort Worth. We really did hit it off. They were pastoring a small but growing church on the east side, and suddenly they turned to Steve and asked, "Would you be interested in working with us as an associate pastor?" Pause. "We can't really pay you a salary, but we do have a church parsonage that you and Barb could live in, rent-free." We didn't even have to pray about it. We said, "Yes, we'd love to." So rescued again by God, We moved into that church parsonage, and Steve began working with the church. The pastor was right that there was no salary, but there was a line on the tithing and giving envelope that allowed people to give a special offering for us as they felt led. So now and then there would be a $10 or a $20 gift, and we were always thankful. My job sustained us for other expenses, and we were content until suddenly I went into work one day and was told I was being let go. Let go? Oh my gosh, how embarrassing. What had I done? Was there a problem? It came without explanation, and I didn't learn until much later that really had nothing to do with me personally. But at the time, I was devastated. How could I tell people I'd been let go from Kenneth Copeland Ministries? It seemed like that was the ultimate job in the world to me, to be working for a ministry I respected so much. I sulked at home for days. I was depressed. I didn't want anyone to know. I was fearful as to how we'd pay our bills, and all my confidence in God's provision went out the door when the shame came in. Several days, perhaps a couple of weeks went by when the phone rang. It was Vicki Jameson. Now, Vicki was well acquainted with Steve, but I still only knew her from a distance. I was pretty much in awe of her as a healing miracle evangelist and held her in high esteem. I was shocked when I heard her voice on the line. "I understand that you might be available for work," she said. "Would you consider coming and working with me in the ministry?" I really didn't know what to say. I was still so beaten down by the enemy in my thoughts, and I had no confidence that I could be an asset to anyone. When my heart spoke, I told her I didn't know if I could, and she responded, "Could you come part-time?" It was enough to get me to reach, and I pulled myself back up to my feet and began to go into the office part-time. She wanted me to help her catch up on letters to partners in need of answers to prayer. All the experience I'd gained in working with Billy and then KCM Prayer Department was put to use as I developed it for her ministry. When I look back now, I realize that I would have never felt what I thought. I would have never left what I thought was such a dream job. But God was positioning me for more than a job. He was preparing me for a call, and He needed to mentor me hands-on by a woman of God who to this day still affects my daily decisions, even though she lives in glory now. Working with her and watching her was like working with Jesus. I walked with her, I worked with her, and learned a rhythm of God's grace that couldn't be learned from a book. I am forever grateful to God that His ways are above mine.